Pleased that you could join with us again. I am John Anderson, as most of you probably know, and I have with me today, to my immediate left, Ken Peters, and to his left, Mike Novak. Mike, that you probably know from earlier episodes on this same series, and Ken, you probably know from his series on hymns and hymnology. Both Ken and Mike have a deep affection for the author C.S. Lewis. And so as a follow-on to the study that we did last time we were together, which was a study on the brothers Karamazov, we chose to pick out well, it's not a novel, Lewis's descriptive book, The Four Loves. And I think it was Mike who first made the connection between the brothers Karamazov and C.S. Lewis in his treatise on the four biblical loves. And I think the reason why, Mike, that you pulled that out was because in Brothers Karamazov, Ivan was the atheist for Dostoevsky, and Ivan explains to his younger brother Alyosha. Now, Alyosha was the youngest, and he was the religious one. But Ivan, the atheist, says that love for one's neighbor in the abstract might be a good idea, but it really is, as a practical matter, unworkable. So, Mike, you went to Lewis and the Four Loves, at least in part, to take apart that concept of love that Ivan was wrestling with, which is, as Francis Schaeffer has said, love being the mark of a Christian. So as we get started here today, I'm wondering, Ken, maybe if you could take just a few minutes and share with us a little bit about C.S. Lewis, the man.
I'd be happy to. Clives Staples Lewis, C.S. Lewis. Most folks don't think in terms of his first and middle name very much. C.S. Lewis was born on November 29th, 1898. And for somebody who was alive when he was alive, that really sounds ancient when you get back to 1898, you know. But
well, you know, he wasn't crazy about Clive Staples either.
No,
that's why he went by the nickname Jack.
That's right. That's right. And he was born in Belfast at that time. His dad was a prosecuting attorney and had a view of life that just sort of tempered him. That life was work, and then you die. And that stuck with him as he grew up. And it was one of the things that I think really worked against conversion, but also one of the things he was freed from when he became a Christian. He died in 1963. And he had a two-year, really tough two-year period with kidney problems and heart problems and prostate problems. In fact, he went into a coma in July 15th. Prior to a heart attack on July 15th, was in a coma. They thought he was going to die, but he came out of it. And then he actually then retired from his position at the college, not before, but after the heart attack, and then died just a few months later on November 22nd, 1963, which I think many of you remember as the day that JFK died, that was assassinated. And of course, that overrode everything. But profound impact in the academic community. And he wrote books about, he received 5 honorary degrees. He was a critic. He wrote literary criticism, literary history. He wrote theology, philosophy, just a broad range of that. And he's still popular today, which is the most remarkable thing. Checked on Google, and you can find his name used at 4,700,000 sites. And that's probably changed since I last saw that number. So that's an amazing thing. But I'd like to talk about his spiritual biography a little bit, just briefly, to get us a sense of where we're going here. Speaking of his childhood and Surprised by Joy, he makes the following statement. Religious experience did not occur at all in his home. I was taught the usual things and made to say my prayers and in due time taken to church. I naturally accepted what I was told, but I cannot remember feeling much interest in it. And then he goes on to say that his mother's death then became an occasion of what some, quote, he said, might regard as my first religious experience. When her case was pronounced hopeless, I remembered what I had been taught, that prayers offered in faith would be granted. I accordingly set myself to produce by willpower, by his own will, a firm belief that my prayers for her recovery would be successful and I would achieve it. When nevertheless she died, I shifted my ground and worked myself into believing that it'd be a miracle, perhaps even thinking about she would come back like Lazarus somehow. The thing that I prayed for, though, hadn't worked, he said. But I was used to things not working, and I thought no more about it. I think the truth is that the belief into which I had hypnotized myself was itself too religious for its failure to cause any religious revolution. I had approached God, or my idea of God, without love, without awe, without fear. It wasn't Aslan, he said. He was, in my mental picture of this hope for a miracle, to appear neither as a savior nor as a judge, but I wanted him merely as a magician. And when he had done what was required of him, I supposed that he would simply go away. So he fell out of religious conviction, the religious belief that he had. And during public school, he fooled with the occult and what have you. And he says, and so little by little, with fluctuations which I cannot now trace, I became an apostate, dropping my faith with no sense of loss, but with the greatest relief. So he became an atheist, and he came out of it again. And that's the other end of this, and that's the other end of the biography that really has an impact on our reading today and what we're doing. He says his slide into atheism was also a slow climb out of it. And McAllister, his biographer, talks in terms of a chess game. And he says, Lewis finds himself in a series of moves which led him to faith in God and to a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. I want to put that in front of you. The moves by themselves weren't so important, but the effect they had as a group were. So he said, and he also said that it would not so much be God's moves against him, but not so much his moves against God, but God's moves against him. He says this, the narrative of Surprised by Joy is not that of Lewis's discovery of God, but of God's patient approach to Lewis. Moving from atheism to the God of the philosophers to the fiery living God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Lewis describes an assertive, active, questing God. Agnostics talk, he said, cheerfully about man's search for God. To me, as I was then, they might as well have talked about a mouse's search for a cat. So what Lewis thought to be an abstract idea about God came to have a life and will of its own. And he has this wonderful picture using Ezekiel. As the dry bones came together in that dreadful valley of Ezekiel's, so now a philosophical theorem about God, cerebrally entertained, began to stir and heave and throw off its grave clothes and stood upright and became a living presence. Can you imagine that image? I was to be allowed to play at philosophy no longer. So the first step was to atheism, but then it moved from there to atheism, to an acceptance of Christianity, and finally to an acceptance of Christ and a personal faith in Christ. And yet that the final step took place, of all things, on the back of a motorcycle with his brother on the way to a park. And he said, and he got on, he said, I know very well when, but hardly how the step was taken. I was driving to Whipsonade one Sunday morning. When we set out, I did not believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And when we reached the zoo, I did. Yet I had not exactly spent the journey in thought. So God pursued him. And he says he got him on the back of a motorcycle on the way to a zoo with his brother. A great image.
How about that?
Okay. There we are.
Yeah. Fascinating man. Somebody that he became a Christian, but not only that, but he spent the next 30 years of his life being one of the foremost apologetics defender of Christianity in the world. So this was to go from a prideful anti-Christian or non-believer, and he was very arrogant, he admits, in mere Christianity. He talks about his pride as being one of his great regrets. He becomes this great apologist. And this is one of the books we're going to be talking about.
And still is.
Yeah, posthumously.
Yeah,
Yeah.
still is.
Yeah.
Right, too.
It's a remarkable life and after effect that he's had
Right.
since his death.
Mhm.
Well, Ken, thank you for that. Mike, I wonder if you could now maybe delve a little bit into our book, The Four Loves,
Mhm.
and share with us a little bit about the book by way of overview.
Certainly. And, as a follow-on to your introductory remarks, another reason why the Four Loves occurred to me as a good follow-on, besides the core theological points that Dostoevsky was making in his book, is that I thought that the Four Loves were very well illustrated in the Brothers K. The brotherly love, the family love, the romantic love, and of course the godly love,
The divine love.
that Alyosha reflected in many of his relationships. So I thought this was a good book, and we're going from a couple of fictional works now to a nonfiction work, basically of opinion. He published the book late in life. He published it in 1960, in the same year that his wife died. He published the book several months before her death, and he married late in life. And his wife was a longtime admirer of his and had some influence on the book. And people wondered how a person who had been a confirmed bachelor could write a chapter on romantic love. Well, his chapter on romantic love is fully informed and somewhat graphic. But in any event, he did marry late in life. So this is a product of his spiritual maturity, these Four Loves. It's a reflection. It's as you said, John, it's a work of extended definition, attempt at it. And it's not an overtly apologetics book like Mere Christianity or his book on the Psalms. It's more of a subjective and imaginative structuring of the concept of love. But his goal was, in the book, was to show that all of the human loves that he calls natural loves in some way are reflections of our nature as given to us by God. So his theme is God is love. And if there's one scripture that reflects his goal in the book, it would be the 1 John 4:7, where John says, "Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God, and whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love." So that's a key touchstone in the book. And he has a number of sub-themes in the book. A main one is that man is made in the image and likeness of God. Man is a creature who is endowed by God with certain godly attributes. And we'll talk about love in a moment, how that works out. We also read in Genesis that man is not supposed to be alone. It is not good for man to be alone. So on page 12 of the introductory chapter, Lewis writes, "We are born helpless. As soon as we are fully conscious, we discover loneliness. We need others physically, emotionally, intellectually. We need them even if we are to know anything, even ourselves." So these are key concepts about the nature of man, and eventually how all of these loves are key to our being and to our relationship with God. So he starts out in these introductory chapters and says what he's not going to cover. He's not going to cover self-love. He's not going to cover the love of inanimate things like love of nature, love of country, love of activities or art or anything like that. He's talking about relationship loves. And the four categories are going to be romantic love between a man and a woman, friendship love, and a category he calls affection love, which is mainly familial love. Those three are the natural categories. And then, of course, there's the perfect love of divine love. Those are the four chapters. And in reverse order, let me just say a couple of things about briefest definitions, realizing that he spends 30 or 40 pages defining and expanding on these categories. So the last chapter of the book is the chapter on divine love, and he uses the Greek words that are from the New Testament, agape, which was the perfect love, the divine love that desires only the good of the other person. It is a selfless love, it's an unconditional love, and it doesn't depend on the other person reciprocating. It doesn't depend even on the other person being lovable. Mm. It is godly love. Mm. The three, what he calls the natural loves, he regards those as gifts of God that makes it possible for us to love. It's part of the common grace of his creation of human beings, that we are able to have this love and to receive this kind of love from others. However, it's conditional, it's imperfect, it's earthly, and it has risks. There's the risk of underloving, overloving, and we're going to talk about that in different categories. So agape love is the charity love. Charity comes from the Latin word caritas, which was the translation of agape, which meant back then be perfect love. It doesn't have the narrow meaning of donating to good causes that we have nowadays. So he calls it charity. The second category is what he calls eros, which is he calls romantic love. And he means romantic love by that. He means the state of being in love between a man and a woman. And he just differentiates that to some extent from sexual love, which he calls Venus, which is an aspect of romantic love. But he said, what I'm focusing on here is that relationship. And he has an interesting phrase. He said the difference is between wanting a woman and wanting that one particular woman. It is the true love. The risks of this category, and he's one of the things he does a lot in the book, as you notice, he talks about the risks of love, which is going to be an interesting concept for people who first come to the book, because he said not all of the love that we have is necessarily good if it gets off track or gets disproportionate. For example, some of the risks of romantic love are jealousy, possessiveness, obsessiveness, and another risk he mentions is that, well, it can even become idolatry. Another risk he mentions is it can become a justification for doing an unjust thing, like leaving your spouse for another spouse, things like that. So every one of these natural loves has a risk of being bad as well as being a very, very good thing. The second natural category, philia, is friendship love. And he talks about a definition of friendship, which I think is, my own personal opinion is it was the strongest chapter in the book. That's a very subjective opinion, because for me, having read the book many, many years ago before rereading it, that was the chapter that stayed with me all these years, one I recurred to and reread. And he said that the essence of a friendship is that you have common interests and common values, common activities. The friendship is always about something, so it's a more external thing, and it's a more giving thing than, in some ways, than romantic love. But he does say that it also has its risks. It's necessarily exclusive, and friendships can become a source of pride and exclusivity, and unloving treatment of other people.
I was just thinking as you were saying that the New Testament word for fellowship is the word koinonia, which means common. it's what you have in common with one another that keeps you together. It seems to me that that whole idea of koinonia can really come under that broader category of the filial love.
Oh yeah, I think it's a perfect fit. I really do. And he talks about friendships in the book. He doesn't mention that group of friends, that famous group of friends he was in with J.R. Tolkien and others, called the Inklings, who met for years at a pub to read their writings and discuss their books and everything. But he does some nice paragraphs on it. You just knew from what you had read about C.S. Lewis, he was talking about his Inkling friends.
Yeah.
I saw a play, two-actor play down here a couple of years ago. One was Lewis and the other was Tolkien. And they just carried on conversation over a period of time. And then Lewis died. And Tolkien is out. Well, I'm not sure which is first, was out by themselves. And you could sense this loss of friendship that came through. They did a terrific job, but in the context of celebrating what God had done. So it wasn't an idolatry. It was just this beautiful thing that was woven into their understanding of the Lord and their understanding of walking in life.
Yeah.
And that Inklings was an important part of that.
Yeah.
I think all of our love relationships can and really should instill in us a sense of gratitude that is part of our nature that God has given us, because it is really, I think, the source of happiness, earthly happiness in this life, is when these loves that we have are in proportion and are reflections of what God wants them to be. And I think, God does say in the New Testament, you are my friends.
You're my friends.
He actually says that.
Yeah.
Of course, there's a condition there if we keep his commandments.
Right.
But all of our friendships are conditional in
That's
certain
a good
ways.
point.
So the last category, which is his most amorphous one, the Greek word is storge, which means affection, is the category of familial love and familiarity. So the most common example he uses in there is parent-child love. But he also includes a wider umbrella here, because he includes the love of pets and animals, and he includes the likings and loves based on familiarity, for example, of siblings, cousins, classmates, shipmates, workmates, colleagues. And he says this category is the humblest kind of love, and it's the most tolerant of loves, and it comes from it arises from nearness. We tend not to choose like we do with friendship and romantic love. In this category, these are people who are in our life, and we become familiar with them and learn affection that way. So these are his four categories. And if the book were just these four categories, it would be an interesting pattern. But the book is a lot more than that, because he in the introductory chapters, he said there are other layers under each one of these categories of love that he goes to describe. He describes three sets of characteristics that makes this book a much richer tapestry of ideas. And these three sets of characteristics or qualities are these. The first one he says is boundaries. He said the boundaries between these love categories are permeable, they're fluid. You move between them. A companion can become a friend. Spouses become friends. And so you can move back and forth between them. The different loves can highly be reflective of God's love. So he's right off telling you these categories are not hermetically sealed. Their boundaries are fluid. The second one, and probably the one he spends the most time talking about, are three different qualities that you have to keep in mind in each one of the sets of love. And the first one he calls need love. That's need hyphen love. And need love is the best example of that is a child for the parent. We need our parents' love. Well, I shouldn't say the best. Maybe the best example is everyone's need for God, or a spouse and a spouse need. So we have this need love, but then the correlative of that he describes as gift love, gift hyphen love. That would be the parent for the child, can be for spouses and friends with mutual giving, and of course, God's love for us, the greatest gifts, gift love. So there are these layers of complication under these topics. And then the third quality he mentions is he calls it appreciative love. And that's where in a relationship we come to really realize something really good about that other person. We come to appreciate. You might think as kids we appreciate our parents, gee, thanks, Dad. Really don't appreciate your parents, I think, until you're an adult. Or in a marriage, you come to appreciate your great spouse as time goes on and you go through the vicissitudes of life. Friendship is the same way. So there are these layers of enrichment within those loves that he weaves like a tapestry. You have the warp of the four categories and the weft of these layers that enrich his definitions in the book and make it a truly great book. The last one is he refers to this other layer called nearness to God. And there are two types of nearness that he talks about. One he calls likeness to God. All men are created in his image, whether good or bad. And the love that people have for one another may or may not bring us closer to God, just because we have this likeness, because our loves can be imperfect, they can be self-centered, they can be defective, and so forth. What he contrasts to likeness to God is nearness of approach. And by nearness of approach, he means love relationships that are in proper proportion, with minimum imperfections as humans, that are reflections of God's love. So, the book is really this complex matrix of ideas. As you read through it and dissect it, it really has profound thought behind it. And it's not perfect. There's some things we're going to, that each person's going to find and read here that says, well, what about this? What about that? But as one man's take on this very large and probably central idea of human existence, it really is an amazing book.
And that weaving is not accidental.
No,
That's part of his artistry, part of the gift that God gave him, how to use language to communicate.
Yes.
Book after book after book, essays, we read them, you're astonished over and over again at what he can say and how he says it and what he brings in, and that's really beautiful.
Well, one of the epithets of him is that a writer referred to C.S. Lewis as the great explainer.
Yes, here you go.
And he sure was.
Yes. Yeah, an apologist, not just on matters theological, but also in matters as it relates to love.
Yes.
Well, let's kick some topics around a little bit. Pastor, you recently gave a sermon in which you quoted another work of C.S. Lewis from The Weight of Glory.
Right.
And it had to do with the topic of rivalry and love.
Right.
Could you reprise that for us?
Well, here's the quote that you're speaking of, and I've always appreciated this. John Piper was the one who really brought this quote to me. But in The Weight of Glory, one of the things that he says, and really something that gets to his main point, was He says, indeed, if we consider the staggering nature of the heavenly rewards promised in the Gospels, it would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures, he says, fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us. He compares it like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at sea. And then he concludes with this really the wrap-up point for him, which is, we are too easily pleased. And what it does is it kind of sets our desires in opposition to one another. So as we think about these four love types that Lewis expresses, I think Mikey puts agape, or divine love, as the paradigm. And he says that is the greatest example of love. And he puts Jesus' words together with this out of John chapter 15, verse 13. He says, greater love has no one than this. This is Jesus speaking, that someone laid down his life for his friend. And of course, that's absolutely what agape love is. It is love with no expectation of anything in return. And of course, that's what Christ did on the cross. He went to the cross with no expectations that we could contribute anything. After all, he created everything. So what is it that we have that he would want? And so Jesus makes this point that the greatest love is laying down his life for a friend, which is agape love, unconditional love. But as is the case with almost everything, there are two opposite mistakes that we make concerning this expression of divine love. I had a friend who used to say to me that truth is like a precipice. We usually fall off on one side or the other. And so there's two equal and opposite mistakes that we can make concerning the expression of divine love. The first mistake is to avoid any sort of love, like Dostoevsky's Ivan, the atheist, who felt like, well, love can be an abstract good quality, but what's the point, because no one can really do it. So I won't do it at all. So I think the application of that is that many people will shut down love because they can't do it right. And to this error, Lewis writes this. He says, to love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give it to no one, not even an animal. Wrap it carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in a casket or a coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. Your heart will not be broken. It'll become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. To love, he says in conclusion, is to be vulnerable. So the first error that we have in looking at, particularly as divine love, as something that's really unapproachable, he says that the first mistake we make is to not to love at all, to become disengaged with everybody and everything. Now, that's the one side of it. There's another side. On the other side of the fear of hurt and failure, on this playing field of love, is the opposite side, which is to engage in the natural loves, eros, stargo, phileo, to such a degree that those natural loves become rivals of the perfect divine love, and in many ways treating those natural loves as though they were idols to stand between us and perfect love. And I think we see that quite a bit. I think we see it in the newspapers every day. I think we see it on YouTube, on Facebook, where people become so wrapped up with temporal love relationships of sorts, that even though those are good things, the natural loves are good things, sometimes they keep it from the best things and they become the mud pies that we enjoy, rather than what God intends for us, which is the best, and that is to bask in the agape love that he has for us.
He has this wonderful little sentence that may speak to what you said. God is love is not, love is God. And that's sort of the sense that God is love is one thing, but love is God is completely different.
He makes those distinctions, you know. What helps you understand that phrase is how he slices and dices the natural loves and their imperfections. But you know, John, what you reminded me of was our book study from several years ago on the Confessions, Saint Augustine, where he traces his whole biography, and he starts out with these one sequence of loves after another, where he starts out with the satisfying his earthly desires. He has a mistress, and he lives a kind of a dissolute youth. He gets beyond that, although he does love the mistress, and he has a child by her, and he's faithful to her. Ultimately, that didn't bring him happiness. He was a philosophy student and a student of rhetoric. He finds philosophy unsatisfying. Ultimately, he moves from Africa to Rome, where he thinks he's finally made it. He's a professor of rhetoric, and he has made it in an earthly sense. The emperor knows him. He teaches wealthy families, and he doesn't like it. And he has these great friendships, and one of his great friends dies. Other friends abandon him. He finally winds up in Milan, I think, up north. He has experimented with heresies like Manichaeism and everything, and he's just in despair. And then he picks up the Bible. He reads the Bible, and he comes to the conclusion where he prays to God and says, "You have made us for yourself. Our hearts are restless until they rest in you." So I think, and Lewis does a lot of homage to Augustine in his books. So Lewis was an Augustinian in much of his outlook. We talked about a lot about the divine love, and it was the goal of the book. But the friendship love too. He talks about this notion of the basis for friendship, which, let me just read a couple of things he says, and we'll keep this around a little bit. Friendship arises out of companionship when companions discover that they have some common insight or interest or even taste, which others do not share with them. He uses the phrase kindred souls. They share a vision. And that's how friendship is born. He quotes Emerson, who wrote a great essay on friendship. And Emerson says, our friendship is about, do you see the same truth, or do you care about the same truth? So this notion that friendship is about something outside the two people, do you find that persuasive, or is it incomplete? Or what was your take on his description of the nature of friendship love?
I loved it. But the image that we've talked about before of the lovers face each other, right, in Eros. The friends look the same way.
Yes.
He talks about that.
Yes.
And one of the things I've been thinking about here the last couple of days as we prepared for this, the idea of the literature and where else it's disappeared. And I thought in terms of Paul and Timothy. And I read an essay once that said that we should almost each one of us pray that we have a Timothy in our lives, somebody that we can turn to, and somebody's walking the same way as we are, and somebody that we love on that friendship level. And, you know, and it's we're showered with agape love. But there's that beautiful picture of Paul having this friend. Timothy. He calls him a brother. I mean, you know,
Right.
time and again, but it's a friendship. Some of the great literature deals with that issue, and you get Shakespeare, Hamlet, and Horatio. Horatio's the only one that Hamlet can tell that he's going to fake that he's mad after he sees his father's ghost. He may, in fact, be mad by the time it's done. There's a series of some of the great novels, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, and Louisa May Alcott's Little Women, Emily Bronte, Wuthering Heights. They have these wonderful friendships. Some of them grow out of childhood and actually transform into romantic love based on that friendship love. So this, I just think his whole sense of this, of the importance of friendship and the beauty of it, and that image of walking side by side, even Mark Twain, Huck and Tom Sawyer, Huck and Jim, and if you know, Don Quixote, he's on a road trip with Sancho, right? And eventually they become friends. They're kind of in completely different classes, but they are friends. And Calvin and Hobbes, how about that one? You know?
Well, let's go with that. We, you know, most of the novels that are regarded as great novels, and even some that are not so great, most of them tend to deal with the romantic love when it talks about love. But you just named, you know, several that illustrate some of these other natural loves, like friendship love, you know, and affection love, and even divine love. And I was wondering if, you know, Pastor, you have any novels that were illustrative of that to you, that reflect these points?
Well, one of the ones I thought of was the Count of Monte Cristo, which included the eros, the love relationship, which became problematic. It began with friends and how the friends became divided, and there's, you know, the sadness of the revenge quality that when something came between friends, but there's also the priest who effectively leads the main character, which escapes my memory at the moment, but and helped him deal with forgiveness. I also, when we were talking about this the other day, we were talking about Les Mis, and the relationships that were there, Jean Valjean and how there was a relationship, a friendship between he and a priest based on virtually nothing. But the priest, when he gave a gift to Jean Valjean, which was forgiveness in the face of public disgrace and arrest, and he told the constable that, no, I gave the silver pieces that Jean Valjean had stolen. I gave them to him, and then he's my friend, and so there's a patchwork of friendship that appears in Les Mis as well.
Yeah. I was trying to think of some examples of friendship love and parental love that is well illustrated in a novel in a very powerful way. And one of the novels I thought of was a novel called Silas Marner.
Oh, sure.
And you may remember Silas became a very bitter man after he was basically kicked out of a community, being wrongly accused of a theft. And his church turned on him, his friends turned on him, even his fiance turned on him, and he became extremely bitter. He moved to another town and lived in his bitterness for a long time. He was a great weaver of textiles, and that's how he supported himself. And he made a lot of money doing that, but he had no people. He was Simon and Garfunkel's rockin' an island, if you will. And then one day, in a bad storm, a woman who has a baby collapses in the storm, and the young toddler comes to Silas Marner's door. The woman dies, and Marner is just touched by this child. And he goes through a number of struggles, but finally retains the child, and he becomes the parent. And the book shows how this heart of stone that he has in him is turned to a heart of flesh through this parental love, and it was so giving and moving, very much a reflection of God's parental love. The other one is a little bit lighter that I thought of, and you may get a chuckle out of this, but I had 3 daughters, and the kind of thing we watched on TV when you have 3 daughters was in the 1980s when they were kids. We watched Anne of Green Gables, and I just loved it. I just loved the character of Anne Shirley. I liked it so much I read the book. And Anne Shirley is a delightful literary character, and she loved her friends. She called them bosom friends. And that was a phrase you could use in 1908 that nowadays they get laughed at. But she would get them into all kinds of activities and so forth because they loved romantic dramas and literature. So she was an intellectual as well, and an interesting book on friendship. So I'm sure there's zillions others we could think of, but it's nice to have these examples of friendship to illustrate. So let's do one more round of questions here, and Pastor, I'd like to send this back to you. In one of the chapters, in the chapter on familial love, actually, Lewis was talking about troubled family relationships, and he used an illustration of King Lear, Shakespeare's King Lear, and another one from Samuel Butler's The Way of All Flesh. And he stops in mid-explanation, and he says this, almost by way of apology. He says, "I am driven to literary examples because you, the reader, and I do not live in the same neighborhood. If we did, there would be unfortunately no difficulty replacing them with examples from real life."
Right.
And I thought that was a very interesting point. And Pastor, you and Pastor Patrick frequently use, and I'll call it erudite illustrations from literature and history in your teaching ministry to make a point.
Right.
And I'm thinking, what are some of your goals and reasons for doing that?
Well, that's a good question. I think that anytime you are speaking publicly, you're on a quest to find some common ground with the people who are listening to you, and to have some point of identification with those people, so that they begin hanging themselves on the things that you say. And so since I don't live in the same neighborhood, which is his way of saying that everybody has a different life in that room that you're addressing. So you try to find out, well, what are some common elements? And what in literature, you find some common elements. How many sermons were built on the back of the white whale? Quite a few. And so because it's Moby Dick is ubiquitous in its acceptance, and so you're trying to find a common ground. Plus, the benefit of literature is, if you go to a movie, even if you see a play, you are told what that situation looks like, how that situation plays out, what the environment looks like. But if you read a book, it's left to your imagination. So you get, when you appeal to literature, even history, you get the added benefit of people's imaginations to help along the connection that you're trying to make with them. So I find it useful to to refer to literature and history to try to establish that common ground.
Very good. Yep. Well, why don't we wrap this up with some conclusions about the book? What generally do you feel about the book, and why you could recommend it to someone, or if you have something particular in the book you'd like to say? Ken, would you like to start that off?
Pass to him. No.
Okay. Go
Well,
ahead, Jim.
No. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll take it from this point of view. Whenever you are thinking about our relationship with God, you're thinking about a divine relationship, one where one of those verses that we used to build this was, "We love because He first loved us." And it goes to the illustration you used of a mouse looking for a cat, which I thought was very at once humorous and insightful view of things, because we didn't go looking after God. God came after us, and then once He found us, as it were, God gave us the ultimate gift from us who He knew couldn't return that. It was the ultimate example of agape love, divine love, and it's unmatched. Now, I will say that we live in a society and a culture that tries to mask its quest for that kind of love, for unconditional acceptance, and instead what they do is they pursue other types of relationships, whether it's filial or whether it's or whether it's erotic. I think a lot of people engage in sexual relationships when really what they want is intimacy, and the deepest intimacy they could have is the relationship with their God. So I think that people run afoul of that, but I think that I think it's just the setting up agape as the paradigm. Let me, if you don't mind me taking more of your time. The other thing is that as it relates to the natural loves, it was a brilliant idea I had, and it just flew out of my ear. But as it relates to the natural loves, I have come to think, and this has been something I just kind of stumbled on in the last few years, that God intends for us to live our Christian life in community. That we're not supposed to be out in the woods by ourselves, living alone. Mm-hmm. That in fact, our faith, our growth in Christ, is predicated on other people pushing us, pulling us, pointing out weaknesses, shortcomings, but then encouraging us at the same time. All of which relate to those different type of loves that Lewis identifies in there too. So I think for those two reasons, I think it's worthwhile with Lewis to hold your hand as you think about those type of loves.
That's great.
Spinning off what you say about community, my thought comes to the study we have of the hymns. Singing alone is one thing, but singing in community is something completely different. And it sort of illustrates worship and even living with Christian brothers and sisters. One of the things that I think about with this book, and what struck me when I first encountered it, was, man alive, love really has a lot of meanings. And in English, we're really limited. Mm-hmm. And we have the one word going, and if we're going to talk about the various kinds of love in a sermon, you end up having to go back to these others, to illustrate them. But in fact, out there, the word love is used to love a car, to love Pepsi, to love the sunset, to love everything. And yet, when I came to this book the first time, I'm going, man alive, where have I been? Mm-hmm. And what a great help it is to have those categories. But I need to go back to your comments about the weaving, because those three sub-themes that he weaves throughout here, when I first read it, were just amazing. This whole idea, I just read, for instance, the doctrine that God was under no necessity to create is not a piece of dry scholastic speculation, he says. And his writing in here makes that true. It's not dry speculation. It's about my relationship, and he goes on, it's essential. Without it, we can hardly avoid the conception of what I can only call a managerial God. God is not our manager, and he loves us. That's amazing. And he's demonstrated it, and that's amazing. And he's demonstrated with someone who says, I want to call you a friend. And we sing hymns like, what a friend we have in Jesus.
Yeah.
So it became, reading this the first time and picking up it really made an impact in my thinking. I wouldn't say about, my salvation, but it had to do with how I walked,
Yes.
and how I approached life from there.
Well, one of the gifts of the Holy Spirit is understanding. And so one of the reasons we read good books is to gain understanding. It makes us a better witness, I think, as we've mentioned in some of our previous sessions. I agree with everything you both said. I had those impressions in my readings of the book. And I think one of the points that struck me hard and gave me a lot of help was the notion of proportion. That, and we get back to the fact that when God created everything, he created the earth, he created the animals, and he created the trees and human beings. And remember what he says after every day of creation, and it was good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so these loves are good. It's only a fallen man who can make them bad. And so in our spiritual walk, we want to keep them in proportion. So, I think the book is wonderful. And if, with your permission, I'd like to tell a story to conclude.
Please.
And it's from literature. And it's one of my favorite short stories by one of my favorite short story writers, O. Henry. And most people will probably say, oh, he's going to tell the story of the gift of the Magi, where the husband gives the wife the brushes and the wife gives the husband. No, it's not. That is not my favorite O. Henry story, although it's very good. My favorite O. Henry story is a short story called The Last Leaf. And it was written around 1900 during a time when they were having an epidemic in New York, a pneumonia epidemic. And it involved two young ladies in Greenwich Village. They were artists. They lived in an artist tenement. And the one young lady gets very sick and is near death. And she is looking out the window at a tree. And there's a tree between the house, in the alley between the houses. The leaves are falling off, and she gets it in her mind. She's going to die when the last leaf falls. Now, the other character in this story is a cantankerous older man who lives upstairs. He drinks, he swears, he makes noise, he annoys everybody, but he's got a heart of gold. And he really likes the young ladies. And he is very concerned about the girl being sick. So the doctor says to the other friend, the other roommate, it's all in her mind. She's not going to make it if she doesn't have the will to live. And so she goes to sleep that night when there's one leaf left on the tree. The drunken man upstairs comes home, the drunken artist comes home and sees the other girl in the corridor weeping. And he asks her what the problem is. She tells him there's one leaf left on the tree. She thinks her friend is going to see it gone in the morning and she's going to die. Well, the next scene is the next morning. And the girl wakes up. They look out the window. The leaf is still there. And she has recovered. She's gotten over the crisis. She's getting better. And that whole thing in her mind went away. But then they hear a siren downstairs, and they look out, and there's an ambulance, and there's a body in the snow. There had been a terrible storm that night, and snowstorm, and there's a body down there, and a step ladder, and a bucket of paintbrushes. And it turns out that the old man upstairs had gone out at night in the middle of a storm on a high ladder and painted a beautiful leaf on the wall of the next building so that it looked like the last leaf had fallen, but he painted it up there so it stayed up, and that she would see it in the morning.
Yeah.
So what that occurred to me was, greater love hath no man than to give his life for a friend.
Yeah.
So these are the kind of things we're seeing in literature.
Well, now I got to go read that story.
Oh, I want everybody to read it. It's a great story. They made a movie of it too in 1952 called Four by O. Henry. They're 4 of his short stories, and one of them is The Last Leaf. It's very good. So
the three of us have kicked around some ideas. Where do we go to next on the heels of Lewis's book, The Four Loves? And we talked about a number of different options, but I think the one that we landed on was the story of Robinson Crusoe. And I read that about a year and a half ago because I was trying to reintroduce myself to the classics, and Robinson Crusoe is certainly one of them. And it is a great story, and I can pretty much assure you that it's going to be different this time you read it. When you read it through the eyes of maturity, as opposed to perhaps when you first were introduced to it when you were 25 or 30, it'll have an altogether different a different meaning for you, and you'll see things that you never saw before. It's a book about one's response to the calling of divine love, and that's what happens with Robinson Crusoe. God gets his attention in the most unusual of ways. And then within that broader category of God pursuing Robinson Crusoe, there's another. That is the agape love, and then there's the filial love, the love between Robinson Crusoe and Friday. And we're not going to say anything more about that. We want you to read it, and we're going to be working on it in the meantime. We'll see you again next time. God bless you, and thanks for tuning in.